In 1940, Hitler and his generals laughed when Franklin Roosevelt promised America would build 50,000 warplanes a year. To them, the idea was absurd. After all, the U.S. had built barely 3,600 planes the year before. But what began as mockery would end in horror. Just 4 years later, one American factory was producing more bombers in a single month than Germany's entire air force could replace. And when Göring was finally captured, even he admitted the truth. America's factories, not its soldiers, had destroyed the Luftwaffe. In May 1940, Europe was collapsing. German tanks had stormed across France, and Britain stood nearly alone. Against this backdrop, Franklin D. Roosevelt made a declaration that stunned even his own advisors. America would build 50,000 warplanes every year. To most, the statement sounded like political theater, a morale booster meant to scare Berlin and reassure London. The reality was grim. American factories had managed just over 3,600 aircraft the previous year, and most of those were outdated models unfit for modern battle. The Army Air Corps could barely scrape together 1,700 combat-ready planes, many of them obsolete biplanes. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, Hermann Göring sneered at Roosevelt's boldness. He tossed the intelligence report aside, mocking it as absurd propaganda. The Americans know nothing of war industry, he told his staff. They think cars and airplanes are the same thing. Let them try. Hitler echoed the contempt, ranting that Americans were weak, racially corrupted, and incapable of waging a sustained war. These prejudices blinded the Nazi leadership to reality. The United States was not bluffing. Even as Roosevelt spoke, industrial leaders across America were already planning to retool civilian factories into military powerhouses. Roosevelt's goal wasn't empty rhetoric. It was a challenge to an industrial base unlike any the world had seen. Where Germany saw only car assembly lines, Roosevelt and his advisors saw a dormant giant waiting to awaken. For Nazi leaders, ideology clouded intelligence. Their own attachés in Washington had warned that American production potential was staggering. Reports describing factories working around the clock, women entering assembly lines, and entire industries preparing to shift toward war were dismissed as fantasy. In truth, Roosevelt had just fired the starting gun for the greatest industrial mobilization in history, one that would bury the Luftwaffe in a flood of steel and aluminum. If Roosevelt supplied the vision, William Bill Knudsen built the machine. Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who rose through the ranks of General Motors, walked away from a $300,000 salary to work for the government at the symbolic wage of $1 a year. To Roosevelt and his advisors, he was the only man who could turn lofty promises into riveted reality. First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen, said Bernard Baruch when asked who could achieve the impossible. Knudsen understood mass production in a way few did. He had overseen the creation of assembly line automobiles that rolled out by the millions. Now, he applied the same logic to aircraft, where aviation had once been a craft industry, slow, meticulous, almost artisanal. Knudsen broke down the process into standardized sub-assembly. Wings, fuselages, wiring, engines, all could be manufactured separately and bolted together in record time. His approach wasn't just technical, it was cultural. Knudsen rallied Detroit's automotive titans, Ford, Chrysler, and GM, and convinced them to treat warplanes as just another product, albeit on a massive scale. "We can build them like Buicks," he insisted. Skeptics laughed, but Knudsen had the credibility to silence doubters. Under his leadership, dormant factories roared back to life. Thousands of new workers were recruited, trained, and set to work. By December 1941, monthly aircraft production had skyrocketed from a trickle to 2,000 planes, 20 times the output of just 2 years earlier. Entire plants were dedicated to a single aircraft model. Ford announced plans to construct a factory so large, so advanced, that it could build bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. The U.S. hadn't yet entered the war, but the arsenal of democracy was already taking shape. Goering's ridicule was about to meet Knudsen's steel reality, and the Luftwaffe would pay the price for underestimating an immigrant engineer who believed America could outproduce tyranny itself. By 1940, the United States was not a military powerhouse. Its air strength looked pitiful compared to the swarms of German aircraft darkening Europe's skies. American plants turned out only a few thousand planes a year, most of them obsolete, and the idea of scaling up production seemed laughable. Even Britain's leaders doubted Washington's claims, quietly assuming Roosevelt's promises were empty rhetoric meant to reassure allies. But they underestimated how quickly America could shift gears. As Roosevelt's call for rearmament spread, Detroit began humming with new energy. Automobile factories that once rolled out Buicks and Chevrolets prepared to churn out fighters and bombers. Production managers tore apart their workflows, redesigning spaces for aircraft construction. Workers who had never touched an airplane part were suddenly being retrained to rivet aluminum and wire instrument panels. By late 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, U.S. monthly output had reached 2,000 planes. This was already 20 times greater than what the country produced only 2 years earlier. Still, German leadership dismissed reports of three-shift factories and women on the assembly line. Nazi intelligence claimed that the democratic workforce was too undisciplined to sustain war production. They convinced themselves that the Americans lacked both skill and will. That blindness would cost them dearly. The reality was that America's decentralized, cooperative model of mobilization was succeeding precisely because it wasn't forced by dictatorship. Thousands of private firms, big and small, joined together under the War Production Board. This network created a level of flexibility Germany could never achieve. Where the Reich relied on slave labor and rigid commands, America harnessed voluntary effort and innovation. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States was already becoming an industrial storm. The boldest symbol of America's transformation was a farm field outside Ypsilanti, Michigan. In 1941, the Ford Motor Company began constructing a factory so massive it seemed impossible. 3.5 million square feet, with a single assembly line stretching a full mile. The goal was as audacious as Roosevelt's promise, to produce B-24 Liberator bombers in quantities Germany couldn't even imagine. At first, the plan was a disaster. The complexity of the B-24 was staggering. Nearly 500,000 individual parts, thousands of feet of wiring, and more than a dozen major assemblies. The first bombers that rolled off the line in 1942 were riddled with defects and had to be rebuilt from scratch. Skeptics mocked the plant as "Will it run?" a cruel pun on Willow Run. Critics claimed the entire experiment proved Roosevelt's boast had been fantasy. But Ford's engineers refused to quit. They dissected the bomber into modules, created hydraulic riveting systems to speed construction, and introduced prefabricated wiring harnesses that reduced mistakes. They even adjusted workflow hundreds of times to accommodate combat-driven design changes. What looked like chaos to outsiders was, in fact, the birth of modern mass aviation. By the fall of 1943, Willow Run's output was climbing steadily, more than 300 bombers a month. In April 1944, the factory reached its zenith, producing one B-24 every 63 minutes, around the clock. That single plant was building more heavy bombers than the entire German aviation industry combined. What began as ridicule in Berlin had become reality in Michigan. Goering's sneer that Americans could never build warplanes the way they built cars had been turned on its head. The same principles that had once delivered automobiles to every driveway were now producing the machines that would darken Germany's skies in relentless waves. Willow Run was more than a factory. It was proof that democracy, when challenged, could retool itself into a war machine faster than tyranny could ever comprehend. By 1943, the Luftwaffe began to sense something it had never confronted before. Not just resistance, but replacement. In the skies over Tunisia, German pilots noticed a disturbing pattern. American planes that had been shot down days earlier seemed to be back in the air, flown by fresh crews. What the Germans didn't realize at first was that this wasn't illusion. It was industrial math in motion. The US had reached a point where even devastating losses could be replenished in weeks. After brutal raids over Europe, bomber groups that lost dozens of aircraft would find their squadrons rebuilt almost overnight. Germany, by contrast, could not replace its fighters, much less the veteran pilots who flew them. The Luftwaffe had entered the war as a professional elite. By 1943, attrition was bleeding away its most experienced aces. The Americans had not only improved in quality, but had become a force of overwhelming quantity. Factories in Seattle, Detroit, and Los Angeles poured out aircraft at a rate that defied belief. Fighters like the P-38 and the P-47 arrived in swarms. Bombers such as the B-17 and B-24 filled the skies in numbers that seemed endless, even when missions went catastrophically wrong, as on Black Thursday in October 1943, when more than 60 bombers were destroyed over Schweinfurt. The U.S. replaced those aircraft in a matter of days. German pilots began describing bomber formations as flying fortresses, not only for their armor and firepower, but for their persistence. No matter how many were destroyed, new ones appeared. The war in the air was no longer about tactics alone. It had become a brutal equation of output, and the math favored America. Göring's ridicule in 1940 had come full circle. His Luftwaffe was now drowning under the tide of planes Roosevelt had once promised, but Germany swore could never exist. In February 1944, the U.S. and Britain launched a campaign that would decide the air war once and for all. Known as Big Week, it was a coordinated assault on Germany's aircraft industry. Over 5 days, thousands of bombers and fighters flew repeated missions against factories, assembly plants, and supply hubs. The goal was simple but ruthless: destroy the Luftwaffe where it was born, in its workshops and training fields, and force it into battles it could not win. For the Germans, it was a nightmare. The raids came in waves, by the hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 bombers at once, escorted by fighters with the range and performance to challenge German interceptors. P-51 Mustangs, newly introduced to long-range missions, cut down Luftwaffe squadrons that had once struck with impunity. The statistics told the story. In those few days, Germany lost hundreds of planes, but worse still, it lost irreplaceable pilots. Veterans with years of combat experience were gone, replaced by hastily trained novices who could barely manage their aircraft. While the U.S. was producing 2,500 fighters every month, Germany struggled to build 1,000, often short on materials, fuel, or skilled labor. Generals on both sides understood the shift. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top commanders, admitted after the war that Big Week was the turning point. The Luftwaffe had been broken, not by a single battle in the air, but by the relentless weight of production. American bombers didn't just survive losses, they came back stronger, in greater numbers, with improved escorts. For the first time, Germany's skies were no longer its shield, they had become its vulnerability. Big Week marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe, proof that the industrial avalanche Roosevelt had promised 4 years earlier was now crashing down on Hitler's war machine. If Willow Run was the symbol of industrial might, then the American workforce was its beating heart. When Roosevelt demanded planes by the tens of thousands, there weren't nearly enough hands to build them. By 1941, most skilled men were either already working in industry or heading off to war. The solution was radical: bring in groups of workers long ignored or outright excluded from the factories. Women, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, the elderly, even teenagers still in school. Everyone was called into service. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the aircraft industry. In 1941, women made up less than 1% of aviation workers. By 1943, they represented nearly 2/3 of the workforce, over 300,000 strong. The cultural image of Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda, it was reality. At plants like Douglas in Long Beach, women were no longer outliers. Out of 41,000 employees, over 22,000 were women. They drilled rivets, wired cockpits, inspected engines, and tested hydraulics with precision that astonished supervisors. One of them, Rose Will Monroe, who became the iconic Rosie, was driving 3,000 rivets per shift at Willow torpedo run with a 99.5% accuracy rate. What the Germans dismissed as desperation proved to be an advantage. Many women excelled at detail-oriented tasks like wiring, assembly, and inspection. Factories redesigned tools and workstations to accommodate smaller hands and shorter statures, only to discover these adjustments boosted efficiency for everyone. The supposed weakness became a strength. African Americans also entered the industry in unprecedented numbers, fighting through entrenched discrimination to claim their place on the assembly lines. At the Lockheed plant in Burbank, black workers pressed for fair wages and training, their contribution undeniable as production soared. The Fair Employment Practices Committee, established under Roosevelt, forced contractors to open doors once closed, adding another layer of diversity to the workforce. What emerged was a national army of workers that defied every Nazi assumption. Goering and his staff believed free societies lacked discipline and that women had no role in industrial strength. Yet America's people's workforce delivered unmatched productivity. The German reliance on slave labor created sabotage, low morale, and collapsing quality control. Meanwhile, America's voluntary workforce, motivated by patriotism and a shared sense of purpose, exceeded expectations. By the end of 1943, it was clear the U.S. didn't just have more workers, it had a stronger workforce, united by freedom, fueled by determination, and driven by the belief that every rivet, every part, was helping bury tyranny under aluminum and steel. While America's factories roared to life, Germany's industrial machine stumbled into chaos. By 1944, Allied bombing had smashed aircraft plants across the Reich, forcing production underground. Göring approved the Jaeger fighter program, dispersing assembly into over 700 underground sites. What looked on paper like resilience became a logistical nightmare. Slave labor filled the tunnels, tens of thousands of prisoners forced to work in horrific conditions. Mortality was staggering. In some facilities, 1/3 of the workforce perished before producing a single usable aircraft. Sabotage was rampant, and components shipped between sites arrived late, damaged, or unusable. Even when completed, the planes often rolled off the line with defects. Engines failed early, radios didn't function, ammunition feeds jammed. German production figures, already dwarfed by America's, became unreliable as propaganda tried to mask the disaster. While Germany struggled to produce a few hundred fighters a month, America was building 2,500 every month, plus thousands of bombers and transports on top. And while Germany tried to hold on with desperation, projects like the Me-262 jet, America pressed forward with improvements to already dominant designs. Boeing churned out 16 B-17s every day from Seattle. North American aviation produced 500 P-51 Mustangs each month. Lockheed built a P-38 Lightning every 90 minutes, constantly updating the design with over 2,000 combat-driven modifications. This continuous feedback loop between combat reports and production floors created aircraft that evolved in real time. American engineers didn't just build planes, they redefined mass production. Modular construction allowed entire subassemblies to be swapped instantly. Hydraulic tools cut fatigue and errors. Statistical quality control, pioneered to keep defects out of bombers, became standard across industries. The result was staggering efficiency. By 1944, U.S. factories produced 96,000 aircraft in a single year, a number greater than Germany's total output for the entire war. And America wasn't even building at its absolute limit. It was producing this while simultaneously supplying the Soviet Union, arming Britain, and fueling a two-ocean war. Germany had pinned its hopes on technology, on wonder weapons and desperate fixes. But as one Luftwaffe ace grimly admitted, what use is a faster fighter when the Americans can build 10 for every one of ours? In the end, the Reich wasn't beaten only in the skies, it was crushed on the factory floor, buried beneath the avalanche of American innovation and industrial scale. By the war's end, Hermann Göring could no longer hide behind boasts or ideology. Captured by American troops in May 1945, he was confronted with statistics that staggered even him. At interrogation, he admitted the truth he had once mocked. That single factory at Willow Run built more planes than our entire bomber force. The very facility he had dismissed as impossible had produced aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down. At Nuremberg, prosecutors displayed charts showing U.S. factories turning out more aircraft in a single month than Germany had managed in an entire year. Films of American assembly lines stunned the court. Mile-long conveyors rolling out B-24s. Women driving thousands of rivets with flawless precision. Engines tested around the clock. Göring's arrogance drained away. We were not defeated by soldiers, he finally admitted, but by factories. His final writings were filled with bitterness. In one note, he calculated the ratios endlessly, fixated on Willow Run. That damned factory broke our backs. On the eve of his execution, he confessed that Germany had gone to war with an industrial giant it never truly understood. The numbers were staggering. America built nearly 300,000 military aircraft during the war, more than 3 times Germany's total. Yet the real triumph lay in the system that produced them. Free citizens, united by purpose, had outproduced a dictatorship built on coercion. Women, immigrants, and minorities, people Göring's regime dismissed as weak, became the very engine of victory. The lesson echoed beyond the war. The arsenal of democracy proved that freedom, when mobilized, could overwhelm tyranny not just on the battlefield, but on the assembly line. Roosevelt's impossible promise had not only been met, it had been doubled. In the end, Göring's laughter in 1940 became the hollow echo of history's greatest miscalculation, silenced forever by the roar of American production.